And so enriching the landscape as much as possible to enable the animal to best look after itself seems to me to tick all of the boxes. That's not to say that they don't require help or that everything is always present in the landscape. So there'll always be a relationship and a requirement for humans to care for these animals.
That was Dr Lindsay Whistance, and you'll be hearing more from her today. Welcome to the Agricology podcast. I'm Matt Smee.
And I'm Janie Coldbeck. Across this season, we're exploring the ideas and practices around optimising carrying capacity for livestock. We'll be in conversation with farmers, advisors, vets and academics as we explore what optimal carrying capacity means to them and how this concept can be supported on farms to help the animal, the environment and the farmer.
I'm Lindsay Whistance. I am a senior researcher at the Organic Research Centre. My focus is livestock. My background is farm animals. So I started milking when I was 17, and that was really the life that I wanted to live through a series of events, particularly with farming becoming more production orientated. I started to enjoy it less and less. The thing about working on farms for me was really being with the animals, knowing the animals. That was the trigger to be there. I never was a productionist. Never really interested in the milk that came out of the cow, just being with the cow. So I started to look at a way of being with the animals in a different way. And the focus really for me was how humans and animals interact on the farm, but also, and most importantly, how we make lives worth living for the animals that we farm. I can fully understand that people have issues with livestock in the landscape, particularly when we look at the way that we are currently farming animals. So the focus that we have on animals as a major source of food for human beings. And what we've done to achieve that, what we've done to them and what we've done to the landscape to make meat and animal products a reality at the scale that we eat them.
We're exploring this idea of carrying capacity and optimal carrying capacity and the practices that can support that idea. But I'm asking everyone from their perspective, what do you think of, or what do you think is this term optimal carrying capacity?
I think for me, the term optimal carrying capacity is a place where the landscape is healthy. When we farm, everything we do in farming is modifying nature in some way, and it has a cost to nature at some level. The challenge for us is to produce food in such a way that landscape recovery is as short as it can be. So when we talk about animals in the landscape, they can give to the landscape, they can certainly give to food systems. But for me, the second strand to this is healthy animals, lives worth living for the animals that are living in those landscapes, functioning in those landscapes. And the optimal carrying capacity, I think, can change from system to system. It can change from soil type to soil type. It can change from species to species. Ideally, there's some mixed species going on in there as well for both animal health and landscape health. And perhaps it's also linked to proximity to humans too. Farmed landscapes close to a city the carrying capacity would potentially be different there compared to vast swathes of upland where there are fewer people.
What do you see the key benefits livestock can bring to the farmed environment?
I think we try to reduce animals. They do have an importance in farming systems at multiple levels. So they are a source of food for human beings. But alongside this, they perform at least another function in farming. If we farm low oil or no oil farming systems, and we're going to have to face the reality of that at some point, then clearly they bring in a source of nutrients to that farming system, which used to be critical to farming systems before we went down the chemical approach anyway, and they're becoming much more relevant now, not perhaps as a no oil approach, but as a cost of oil approach. And I think it's becoming increasingly recognised the value of bringing lays into arable rotations, so the resting of that land, and then it becomes logical that animals are part of those lays. So they have, I suppose they have two functions there. They bring in nutrients, but they also act as a resource in that farming system. In some ways that leads me on to the other role that they have, which has got nothing to do with humans, and it's their role as a natural part of the landscape ecology. So in some ways, when you bring the grassland back into a rotation, you're also giving them back in some ways, giving it back to the animals in the landscape. And I know it's very artificial because all of this is managed by human beings, but I have a real issue with this idea that these large animals, just because we farm them, that they are a problem animal, rather than recognising their value to the landscape, independent of human beings. So if we look at how much grasslands we have in the UK, much of it can't be ploughed, can't be put under alternative food systems, and the growing recognition of the importance of grasses in rotations, that makes for a lot of grazing. And these animals, even if we didn't eat the animals, they would be critical to the natural ecological health of these landscapes. And I do wish we acknowledged that point more than we do. So when you've got a poor landscape, really the only thing you can do is have ruminants in that system, if we're talking about food production, but also if we're talking about ecological health. So I'm reminded of various examples where landscapes have been overgrazed, and then as a response they've been undergrazed, and the ecology suffers in both of those instances. So clearly there is a carrying capacity which manages ecological health, and I think we seriously need to start looking at that. Yes, we have challenges with producing food. Yes, we have a growing human population that needs to be fed. But I think if we're talking about food, then we should be looking first and foremost at how we distribute food and how we manage the food that we already do produce. And there are two issues that I can see there. One is waste. Everybody knows we're a very wasteful species. And what we then use food for when we do produce food. So you walk into any supermarket and healthy food is only a proportion of the shelves of all food available. So how we use the food that we already grow to make non-nutritious food, we should seriously be questioning that. And then I think we should be looking at how we manage farm animals to justify it morally, whether we should be farming animals intensively or farming animals for landscape health. That's a slightly separate issue from low oil or no oil food production, and it might well be that the carrying capacity in those two different scenarios is different. I don't know, but I think that's where we should be looking to understand more of what those two carrying capacities look like in different landscapes.
So from a sort of a food, looking at it from a food production standpoint, or looking at it from a livestock management perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly we should be farming animals to a high welfare level, but farming animals in terms of the landscape as well. And I know this is not black and white, because there are many different ways of managing the landscape, you know. So we know for sure that not moving stock on is the least productive way of farming. So if you have rotational grazing, then it's more productive. But then if you employ one of the multiple mob grazing type grazing systems, then you can increase both production of grass and of carrying capacity of animals in that landscape. And I'm not remotely suggesting that any of these are wrong, but I would then ask questions of what is the knock-on effect in these landscapes, what else is being impacted. One of the things that I often think about when we look at strongly managed grazing systems, so animals are being moved fairly quickly through the landscape, whether they've got access to the things that they need to live a good life, so shade and shelter, personal space. So when we talk about stocking density, it may be that these animals are experiencing quite a lot of stress because the animals are no longer there in the landscape as part of the landscape. They're merely tools to manage pasture and grass growth.
The sort of conflicting thing here whereby a strategy for effectively managing the landscape with livestock and optimising carrying capacity, those strategies can actually have a negative impact on the livestock welfare and natural behaviours as well.
Yes, potentially. I'm not saying it's a given, but what I think is that we need to look at them both more as a partnership. So my heart often sinks when people say that animals are a tool to achieve something. And what I hear is they have no ownership, they have no place in the landscape other than it being a wholly human managed relationship.
So is there almost a natural link between that mindset and then by categorising them as a tool, even in an extensive system that has the ecology of the land at heart and, optimising production at heart rather than maximising, you can still, with that mindset of they're a tool, it still leads to negative potential issues, negative outcomes for the animal itself?
Well, at the very least, it's a lack of acknowledgement that the animals have a fundamental place in that ecology. It's a human construct that we are using them as a tool to manage the landscape in which they live, they come from, are part of. I fully accept that we do need to manage them in some way because we have fences, we have ownership of land where these animals are no longer able to roam freely and make wholly independent choices. Yes, of course, humans have a duty then to make sure that the landscape is cared for, but that includes the animals. They're not apart from, they're a part of.
This sort of touches on the kind of something you introduced me to, which was the ancient contract. Can you just expand on that a bit for people listening so they can sort of, because I'd never come across it. I think it's a wonderful thing and it frames a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so the ancient contract is something that you come across occasionally, but it's very rarely referred to. So we have hundreds of years of history of being with and working alongside animals. The ones that we have in the countryside today are representations of that relationship. There are no wild cattle anymore. We may have some feral animals such as the Chillingham cattle, but these are already on the process of domestication. So what we see in today's landscape are the consequence of a long relationship with human beings. And so rather than say that we're not responsible, actually we are wholly responsible for their welfare. And this is what the ancient contract means. We signed, maybe not on paper, but we signed this contract a long time ago, this duty of care to these animals. And I think if we look very closely at how we treat them and manage them, there are lots of things that could be improved, really dramatically improved, to say that we are honouring that ancient contract.
Earlier you were talking about waste and industrial livestock sort of production. For you to highlight some of the top issue or key issues with livestock production in its current guise that goes against this concept of optimal carrying capacity.
Yeah, I think the challenge is with looking at good animal welfare in different housing systems is that what good animal welfare means to different people. So I'm often mindful of a paper that was written by David Fraser, where he wrote about an example of a particular animal in a particular system, and different animal scientists considered the welfare of these animals and judged it to be different. And what he wrote about there were three fundamental ways of looking at animal welfare. One was to look at their physiological health, so were they functioning biologically? Another way was to look at their emotional health, so did they thrive in the system that they were being managed? And the final one was to look at their ability to show natural behaviours, so could they express who they were as an animal in that system? Could they do the things, what it means to be a cow? Could they be a cow? And depending on your outlook, you could judge this particular example in very different ways. The reality is, of course, good animal welfare is all three of these things. But if you have animals in an intensive system, you typically focus on the biological functioning aspect, so the physiological health of this animal, and the challenges then are to keep that animal in good enough health to keep producing. But when we're looking at health in the round, we're looking at these animals as autonomous beings in their own right, both as individuals and as a member of a herd, and being fully able to function as a fully paid up member of that species. So I think we have to be looking at more extensive systems to enable the animals to show who they are as a species and to ensure that they experience good welfare at all three of these levels.
That's a really tidy way of putting it. It's a great reference as well to that David Fraser paper. So yeah, we spoke about practices a little bit and some of the issues, and I want to talk about those in a bit more detail, but I want to talk about the type of extensive practices that can provide this holistic support, hit those three areas.
One of the most important things that I look at when I look at animal welfare in the landscape is really the ability of the animal to look after itself as much as possible. There's a growing body of research that shows that the animal is aware of its health status, that it is looking to balance its health status, certainly if that's possible through nutritional means. And so enriching the landscape as much as possible to enable the animal to best look after itself seems to me to tick all of the boxes. That's not to say that they don't require help or that everything is always present in the landscape. So there'll always be a relationship and a requirement for humans to care for these animals. But by building the capacity into the landscape as much as possible enables these animals to be a more integral part of the nature in which they live. Of course, in a more applied setting, if you like, then herbal leys become much more important, let's say, than the classic ryegrass clover mix, which is looking more predominantly towards production. But it's clear that when you bring these herbs in, if the animals are aware of them, have experience of them, then they will graze them very readily. And I'm reminded of a video that a farmer in Cornwall showed me, where he had sown a herbal ley and some of the herbs had not taken. And rather than oversow the whole field, he decided to put a strip in. And he showed me this video, and once these herbs had established, he had gone out to check his stock, and he was swinging across the field with his phone camera, and there were no animals at all in the field until he got to the 12-metre strip, and all of them were grazing this 12-metre strip. So he said he was a bit cross that they were eating this now established strip of herbs, but they were saying very, very clearly that these were herbs that were highly attractive to them. And so, you know, it's a good illustration of how an enriched landscape is important to the animals.
So really, no one's framed it like that at all. You know, sort of, yeah, they've spoken about single line practices or what they're doing on farm, but as a theory and a concept and a way to look at, here's my farming system, how do I enrich this landscape? So it's really nice to dive into the applied side of it as well. Sort of what can we populate the landscape with to enrich it? So herbal lays is one. We can talk about tree hay is another, and there's a lot to be said on that. And I think it's quite a hot topic at the moment.
Yeah, so alongside the grazed plants, of course, we've got trees and shrubs. So farming vertically, but farming in a way that allows the animals to adopt or refine natural behaviours. So all of our livestock, every single species that we farm is also a browser in some form. Bringing that in not only allows them to show their natural behaviours, of course it extends the food types, the food sources that are available to them, and the other chemicals that are in these trees. So we're talking about plant secondary metabolites. The thing that these plant secondary metabolites do is almost cater for things that are not perhaps or less related to growth and production, but nevertheless keep the animal healthy and able to produce and grow. So the kinds of things we're thinking of here are tannins, condensed tannins, which can help with parasite burdens. Just the act of browsing as opposed to grazing gets the animals out of that risk zone for taking in parasites, so offering them that choice. And of course the presence of these trees in the landscape are really critical for thermal comfort. So shelter from the wind, shade from the hot sun, and these things are going to become much more important as we move into the changing weather patterns related to climate change. And they're already happening. I think most farmers have an experience of the summer of 2018. Those are going to come thick and fast. By 2050, the Met Office are saying we'll get such a summer every second year. Shade for our livestock is going to be critical, and establishing that shade before then is going to be key to good systems.
And I guess if that's got to be built in advance, it's creating the right tree in the right place.
Yeah.
That actually can have multifunctional benefits for the livestock and the farm, business, health of the farmer, you know, all that stuff as well.
Yeah, so right tree, right place is critical, but I often find, even though it's a very good sentiment, it feels like it's a barrier to, oh, what if I get it wrong? So I've often talked to farmers who are looking to put more trees on their farm and worried about where to put them and how to get that right, but be very accommodating with the existing trees on the farm. You know, the trees that are there are not the problem. It's the trees that are not there that are the problem because of this idea of getting it wrong. And of course you can get it wrong, but with a few principles of considering how your farm flows, knowing what kind of machinery you've got and when machinery needs to access different parts of the landscape, those kinds of things. Planting, if you're going to be planting in rows, making sure the rows are going the right way for what you want to achieve from them, whether they be light levels or shelter. But I think the reality is the loss of production from trees is going to be less of a worry than the loss of production from bad weather. So we're going to come into these hot summers where grass growth is going to be a challenge, full stop. So it's not really the bringing the trees in, loss of production, that we need to be worrying about. And in fact, it might be the trees that save production at some level, because they naturally bring in this shade, and they also hold moisture from evapotranspiration processes. This moisture is held closer to the ground, so it's held in a place where it can still be of value to the grasses and the production system. But of course you can help by growing longer stems, so allowing better establishment of grasslands, herbal lays, and not grazing tight. So you're not putting the plants in such a stressed state before you're asking it to grow again. So that will certainly help, but that's typically not the way we farm. If you're looking to produce multiple cuts of silage every year, you're cutting, that first cut is quite a critical time, and you require that regrowth. If you've got a dry spring, then already you're losing production, and that can be really critical for a system that's relying on that level of dry matter being produced every year.
While we're on this, what's going on with the root system within the grasses, whether it's being cut really tight for silage or it's being grazed really hard, what's happening there that means when you get later in the summer and it's hot and it browns off, what's going on with underneath the ground?
When we cut grasses tight, we don't allow for root systems to develop. So it might be that while the grass was growing, the root system was growing, but once you've lost that top, you're also losing roots. So they're sloughing off those deeper roots, keeping that plant in a stressed state, but also reducing its ability to gain nutrients from deeper levels and along with moisture. Of course, when the weather is clement, these plants can recover and have done so multiple times a year. But as we're moving into these systems, and that might be too wet or too dry, we're causing increasing problems for food production for the animals.
Looking at problems with some of these strategies that can enrich the landscape, through the lens of farmers adopting them and the difficulties they might face, the kind of unintended consequences. I'm going to go mob grazing, but they don't realise that if they're doing that too intensively, then animals can't display their natural behaviours.
Yeah, so some of the challenges that farmers might face when they're looking to increase resilience in the landscape, and I link resilience with health, because it's really about this recovery. If the landscape is recovering in good time, then it means that it was able to respond to the challenges that we put upon it through food production systems. I think perhaps the most important challenge is fair recompense. And I know we can't solve that in a podcast, but there's absolutely no doubt that farmers farm in ways that are imposed upon them in order to make a living out of farming. And that's probably the biggest tragedy. That's probably had the biggest impact on climate health and landscape health than any other single factor. I think for those who are able to consider the landscape health in their systems, I think perhaps some of the challenges here might be understanding that some kind of rotational grazing practice is important, but then how far to go, which grazing practice to adopt. And there are lots of different systems out there, all of them saying that they are the only way to do things. Of course, we really need, our antennae need to go up straight away when anybody is suggesting there's a silver bullet for anything. We have to have a toolbox. You have to respond to the landscape. So any advisor can come in and say that there is a good way of doing things. But I would argue that farmers are probably best placed to understand their own landscape. For sure, other voices are important in that narrative. So you might have somebody like me who's an animal welfare person coming in, or you can have a biodiversity person, somebody who knows a lot about something offering their voice in the mix. But the challenge is that it's always the farmer who's left with making the decision to juggle all of these factors. And I would argue that they're still best placed to be that person to do that. The challenge, of course, is when you start to use the animals as a tool, or you're only considering the animals as an end product, not as the life that they have lived getting to that point of harvest. And this is partly where our food systems drive farmers to go, because it does become about that end product, not about the experience of farming, living with those animals, alongside those animals in that system.
You characterise the farmer being the right person to make the decision really well, and having a toolbox of options rather than just being this silver bullet or yes, this is the best strategy, and responding to the landscape. Observation is something that's come up quite a lot during the interviews, particularly Richard Gantler was quite not hot on it, but he and Robert Barber actually as well. They really drove that.
Yeah.
But this sort of brings us to the balancing act.
But these are farmers who haven't let that go. They've held on to the value of seeing things with their own eyes, but they've got the capacity to see as well. They've still got that headspace.
No, and I think Richard's stuff was sort of like, I kind of asked him, is it because it's grounded in biodynamics? And he sort of, yes, some of it. So he spoke about Obsolim, the technique Obsolim, the French thing. So he spoke like that. Yes. But he sort of said, yes, it's grounded in biodynamics, but it's the whole farm system approach that keeps bringing him back to observing.
Yeah, because it's fundamental to farming. This is the thing. I mean, you can put labels on anything, but it's critical to farming, and it might be a bit twee to go back to the poem, what is life if full of care we have no time to stand and stare. But that is where you see things, that standing and looking at your animals. And this is partly the challenge when we've multiplied the number of animals and reduced the number of people looking after those animals. That ability to see has been taken away. Now, part of that has been replaced by technology, but it's technology for a production purpose rather than health purpose per se. And there are always things that people pick up on that a machine or a piece of tech can't see. And that's where the relationship bit becomes important. And that can't be removed out of the narrative, partly for human health, certainly for animal health. But understanding health in those three areas that I spoke about earlier, there are quite a few issues in production systems where a lot of animals are in the same place, very few people working with them, a reliance upon technology or flow, so very strongly directed flow of activity and animal movement on farm. So at the same time we've got these systems with so little time to spend with the animals, the things that we do spend time on are inherently negative. So when we think about hoof trimming, we think about artificial insemination. These kinds of practices are not positive for the animal. Now, it might be that hoof trimming ultimately leads to better health for the animal, but the act of hoof trimming itself is a negative experience. So on the whole, animals' relationship with humans has become worse over time. And those observational things that we used to do are now being done more and more by technology. So when they interact with humans, it's not a great experience for them on the whole. And that has a direct negative effect on their health. So we can see reduced growth rates, We can see fewer animals getting pregnant, so AI is less successful, and it can be directly attributed to the relationship with the humans. So observation is key, but only possible when there's time. And time is both related to the amount of work, but the number of animals. So recognising the animals that you're farming and knowing when things are different, knowing when things are not normal, and so that you can respond and return normality. Technology can be a really positive thing. It's not an either or, not by any stretch. And people are finding the compromise to be a very good one at times. The challenge is that if a machine is doing something or the tech is doing something, then in time-pressed systems, those things get dropped, that you stopped. So I've seen this in robot milking systems, where the idea is not that you spend less time with your cows, but you spend less time milking. But the reality is that you do spend less time with your cows because there are always other jobs that need doing. And so your relationship with them is compromised. So it's a real challenge. There's absolutely a place for technology. Absolutely there is. The challenge is to make sure that the human-animal relationship is not compromised by its use.
You've spoken really eloquently about the relationship between environment, animal and farm health, and then the relationship of humans, animals and the environment. And I'd just like to talk about this kind of the triangle that is that, and re-leveling it or rebalancing it, and sort of exploring your ideas around that.
So I've come to this topic through an animal welfare lens because that's my focus. But clearly animals are farmed for food production, so they have to be looked at in a wider context. And it was really part of that kind of thinking that made me look at why animals are in the landscape. So they have these three different roles. One as a food animal, one for the farm system itself, and one as an ecological component, if you like. But the animals are one of three partners in this food production system. So we've got the human beings, we've got the animals that we farm, and we've got the landscape. And I'm keeping the animals separate to the landscape, even though they belong within the landscape, because they have this other role as food for humans. So we've got these 3 points on the triangle, if you like. And in an ideal world, it would look like a much closer partnership. What we currently have is human interests trump both landscape health and animal voice, if you like, for want of a better descriptor. So instead of having a triangle that is horizontal, denoting equal partnerships, we've got a very top-heavy vertical triangle with humans absolutely at the top. So when we look at population levels, there's a huge amount of criticism for the numbers of animals we have on the planet and the pollution that they are causing. We don't really consider that it's the humans that are responsible for these numbers of animals. It's very easy to blame the cow for the methane. There are some voices about human population, but we accept that the human population is growing and that the planet has to find a way, some way, to feed these people. What I would argue is that the way we've been producing food up till now is doing everything a disservice. So human health, nutritional health, has been taking a nosedive. We look back at wartime rations, and whilst food may have been short, human health was much better in that scenario. We look at what we do with food, a lot of it is non-nutritional food. We waste good foodstuffs on poor food. So humans are certainly not benefiting in terms of nutritional health. Animals are certainly not benefiting from being considered a component of human food systems to the degree at which they are. I fully respect vegan and vegetarian approaches to food intake, and of course that has to be a personal choice. But when I look at animal populations, there are very few animals that can manage their population numbers in terms of available food. So if we want to, if you like, reintroduce the idea that these are animals that are integral to landscape systems, separate to the human interests, we would still need to manage their population in some way. And we only have to look at what's happened to rabbit populations and deer populations over time. So there was a time in history when you could simply lose your life by eating a rabbit or deer. We've got to a point in our history where rabbit as a source of meat was demoted to the point where the human response was to introduce a disease to control the population. Both cruel and incredibly short-sighted. Here we have a good meat source. Here we have a species that requires population control. To me, it's an absolute no-brainer that we eat that meat. Because if you're requiring population control on some level, it makes no sense that you don't then utilise that as a resource. The challenge is to find the level at which we can maintain animal health through population management. It might be more complicated in terms of our domesticated livestock, but it's nevertheless an important point to look at that. And then it might be that the meat that is available to us is determined by that rather than by want. So it looks as if feeding human appetite for meat is never ending. So we've got high-rise pig systems in China feeding this appetite for meat. People will seemingly eat more and more meat regardless of the ability of the planet to carry that level of animals in the landscape. So the cost to the landscape, particularly with monogastrics in terms of raising forests to the ground to produce enough protein for these animals, there really is no resilience. There's absolutely no sustainability in those kinds of systems.
You said a really interesting, you used the word demoted with the rabbits, around demoting them as a sort of a demoting their meat or what they could add to the food system. And I feel like when we're talking around balancing landscape health, animal health and human health, the demotion of livestock to just a tool is leading to an awful lot of this that's, you know, equivalent to how we dealt with overpopulated rabbit systems, and demoting them to just a tool is why we have high-rise pig systems, because the fundamental core role that they play and the need for equilibrium, they've been demoted, and it's having a knock-on effect.
Yeah, so similarly with the rabbits, they were once the king's meat, and now they are worth nothing. They're worth less than nothing because we don't even consider their welfare while they're dying from a debilitating disease. And yet they're really quite valuable in the landscape, even though they're not native to the UK, so they were brought over from the continent. They perform really important roles in the landscape, so their grazing habits are important for ground nesting birds. They go alongside each other, and now that the rabbits are also suffering from hemorrhagic disease, some of the farmers interested in managing wildlife on their farms are now having to perform the function of rabbits using machinery. So cutting the grasses down in these patches in order for the ground nesting birds to maintain their populations. So, I mean, this is a typical human thing. You know, we are reductionist creatures by nature, but it's a very short-sighted thing when we also regard ourselves as guardians of the planet. It doesn't work well that we are always reducing things, whether that be food production or managing diseases in a particular way, using components that cause issues further on in the food chain, whatever that might be, resilience in antibiotics, those kinds of things. We don't have the luxury to be reductionist creatures, and yet it seems to be we are that by nature.
Do we need to have there's sort of a philosophy element here to how animals are treated and looked at and used in the system by farmers and people who produce livestock. So does it come down to the need for a mindset shift, or can it come in other ways?
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult question to answer, because there's an element of chicken and egg. We used to have mixed farming systems, so you weren't one or another. You didn't have just beef cattle. You had a fully mixed system of different species of animals alongside crops. The challenge with that is that people are better at some things than others. So there have always been people who are closer to animals, who understand them better and make better stock people, just as there are people who are better suited to crop growing. I guess in a modern context, the ideal would be that, given that we already have single purpose systems, that farmers in some way can link up. So you have these specialist individuals, but working in systems where they are all present in some form.
What does the system need to be to facilitate those who are the best stock person they can be within the sort of monoculture system?
Yeah, so being good at what you do, of course, it can only happen in a system that enables you to be that best version of yourself. And of course that goes back to economy again, so being paid a fair price for food produced. But I think it also goes back to a society that accepts this idea of custodians of the landscape. This is particularly challenging in a climate where the need to produce food is a very strong narrative, and where you've got alternative visions of the landscape. So I guess people who are more resilience minded would be looking at the land sharing model, where there is a place for nature in all farming, versus the land sparing idea, where you've got intensive food production on tracts of land and then there is set aside for nature elsewhere. What I would argue is that that's pretty much what we've been doing, and it's what has led us to this nosedive in ecological health. So doing more of the same really doesn't make any sense. And the tragedy of this, of course, is that when you set aside pockets of landscape for nature, those areas are also compromised by the intensive farming systems around them. So the flow of nutrients, where you've got plants that can only survive on nutrient poor soils, you're seeing still a loss of landscape. So there's a degradation overall. And I think in some ways this approach should be challenged for two reasons. The landscape, yes, humans rely on the earth, but the earth doesn't belong to humans. So to wholly claim swathes of landscape exclusively for human use, I find incredibly arrogant and ultimately short-sighted, because, as I say, this land-sparing approach has already led to such degradation.
There's always room to add more.
Yep.
I'm not just going to go, we're done, but I want to just ask one question, and we can't talk about livestock without talking about emissions. And often livestock, particularly ruminants, get reduced to emissions, just emission factors. And how does that make you feel?
I think the focus on emissions is a consequence of our poor farming overall. I think it's an outcome of complete imbalance. We talk about these emissions as if they are wholly bad, And yet when we look at carbon, carbon is a building block of life. It's utterly necessary for life on Earth, but we see it as part of a problem. Its existence is not a problem, it's how it's cycled. And that's what we have done very, very badly in our food system. So the emissions are a function of a poor system. Now, that's not to say that emissions at ground level, if you like, aren't part of that system, because they are, and that goes for every living thing. But when we reduce an animal to its emissions, it's really an acceptance of a failure of the way we are farming. We can't separate emissions from the living element. It's a necessary part of it, or a byproduct of living. So I tend to really just be frustrated by this whole narrative. That's not to say that I don't understand that it is a problem, because it absolutely is, but it's this balance, it's this recognition that these gases are a part of the systems that we live in, but it's because we have pushed them to the extremes that we're now having to talk about food systems at the molecular level.
That's really interesting characterisation of it, and no one has characterised it in that way. You created this content thread, it's all come from your thoughts, and we've sort of scratched the surface today. We've gone a bit lower in points, and there's some brilliant threads in it, but it's almost like we could talk for another 8 hours on this. God, yeah. But it's what you've said today, and it's what you've said in previous conversations that's kind of been echoed today, that's led on to these what will be in the next episodes of the podcast after your one, following the individual farmer thread, taking these ideas and hearing them from different voices and with their lilts on it as well. To kind of, and this whole series won't create answers.
No,
it will create sort of a load of bullet points. Maybe.
Do you know what? Hopefully, though, because this is where it all has to end. Is how do you recognise that what you're doing is wrong? Think about the bits that are missing, and then turn that into practice, rather than just having a fight between these two bits. Like, oh, we've got to feed the world. Yes, but there won't be a world to feed if we don't look after the world. Wah, 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 wah. And nobody gets to the point where saying, let's be grown up about this. We're fucking up the planet. How do we feed ourselves, but try to... It's a bit like, all these indigenous peoples, when they perceive the debt, they position their existence as a debt to the planet or a debt to future generations. If we thought more in those terms, we would understand what we do as consumers, and consumers without limits. Yeah.
It's brilliant. I'm going to have to wrap this up because it's now 10 to 6.
Is it?
Yeah, and so one, I've nicked way more of your time than I should have done, but two, I have got to get back.
Yeah, of course you do.
For my kid.
Yeah.
I thank everyone, but I need to thank you more than anyone else, because without you, this wouldn't have started. This idea that came from you. So one, I really appreciate your time today, and your thoughts. It's a real privilege to get the time to sit and chat with you. But two, I've had extended exposure on this topic because you set us off on it, and because we've had so many chats about it. So that deserves a big thank you as well.
Thanks for listening into this episode. Check out the show notes for links relating to this discussion and further reading.
Our thanks go out to the Linbury Trust, whose funding made this podcast series possible.
Don't forget to visit the Agricology website for more information about the practices discussed in today's episode.
There'll be more episodes coming up, so don't forget to tune in again.